Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today. Aging, sickness, and death do not shut down for the summer. Therefore, neither do we as regards Dharma listening. My name is Jim Pollard. I'm a minister's assistant here at the temple. So I'd like to talk about this, the handout with you, but first some preparatory remarks. Some may be quite new here, and so I'll try to fill in. The tradition represented at Orange County Buddhist Church is called Shin Buddhism. You can see that written on the front of the service book. Or in Japanese, the term is Jodo Shinshu. Jodo Shinshu. It is the teachings and life experience of Shinran, a person who lived 800 years ago in Japan. And we regard him as the founder of Shin Buddhism, although he did not actually see himself in that manner. It may seem surprising, but we do not say much about Shinran's teaching at our services. Now, why is that? Perhaps it's the assumption that, well, people are not familiar with this teaching, and therefore we cannot discuss it. In that case, I think the assumption becomes self-fulfilling. Familiarity with Shinran's teaching and awareness of Jodo Shinshu will not develop. Today I will try to share one aspect that I consider to be important. That's the role of skillful means in Shin Buddhism. So it might well be asked, must we study the teachings at all? Or can we develop an intuitive appreciation of Shin Buddhism? Of course, both approaches are possible, so we might choose the one that is best for us, studying or intuition. And frankly, we don't have to choose just one or the other. We could use a combination of studying and intuition. Long ago in Japan, there were people with little or no schooling who arrived at a deep intuitive understanding of Shin Buddhism, often by enduring great personal hardships. They are known as myokonin, which means wondrously excellent people. And even today, there are still such exemplary followers. I feel that I have known a few of them. The best way for us to become like them, I think, is to have grown up in the presence of parents and grandparents who themselves had a deep intuitive appreciation. Their way of being would have touched our hearts, and we might, well, become like them. But what about the person who did not have such an upbringing, who did not encounter Shin Buddhism until later in life? For that person, the intuitive approach, it may not be easily accessible. That person may need to make the effort to learn about Jodo Shinshu. It would mean listening to the words of Shin Buddhist teachers, reading contemporary books on the subject, and examining Shinran's writings. In addition, we must reflect seriously on our own motivations and on the content of the teachings. None of this happens overnight. A sustained effort is needed. By all means, take the intuitive approach if possible. I should add, however, Shinran, this person we regard as our founder, he did not do so. He was about as far from being a myokonin as you could get. For him to develop an appreciation of Jodo Shinshu required tremendous effort rather than intuition. He had to abandon his intuitive notions. It was necessary for him to become perhaps the greatest Dharma listener in the history of Pure Land Buddhism. It would be vain for us to think that we could emulate Shinran's level of Dharma listening, but I would still argue that he, rather than the myokonin, is the appropriate role model for many of us. We must engage in serious study and reflection. So I'll just pause for a moment, see if you have any comments on what we've talked about so far. And there's microphones if you wish to. Does anyone feel you've met a Myokonin? You've met a person who had that kind of intuitive or kind of gut level understanding of Shin Buddhism? I mean, I think I have. So I hope you'll meet such people. And usually they may not seem too unusual at first, but after you get to know them, you'll realize how special they are. So anyway, I hope you get to encounter such people. If you come to the temple, there's a chance that you will, or go to other temples in our tradition. So with that framework in mind, I'm going to talk about the material in this handout, and I am hoping to convey some of the important features of this one aspect of Shinran's teaching. And since we're kind of foolish, ordinary people, we won't understand it all right away. It doesn't work like that. We have to take this in kind of on a regular basis and begin to live with it, and then it will seem more real to us. So this is just one aspect of Shin Buddhism that I'd like to share. Skillful means, which is something that is part of all of Buddhism, not just Jodo Shinshu. Impermanence or continual change is the basis of Buddhism, but we as foolish beings often have difficulty coping with it. One type of change that may provoke discomfort is to revise the words used to express the teachings. Yet, to keep the words fixed is impossible. From ancient India, where Buddhism originated, to medieval Japan, where Shinran lived, to 21st century America, the differences in language and culture are serious obstacles to our understanding. Every person who attempts to translate and interpret will offer a limited perspective. How can we find words to express the spirit of Shakyamuni, that's the historical Buddha, the person who lived in India 25 centuries ago, the spirit of Shakyamuni and of Shinran? In the Buddhist Churches of America, that's the umbrella organization to which OCBC belongs. In the Buddhist Churches of America, we have rituals like chanting, incense offering, and in some cases, we have English words that go along with them. Those words are temporary expressions of the teachings, and they have to be refreshed periodically, or they will become what I would call fossilized. Without being refreshed, rituals can turn into automatic gesturing and reciting. The meaning that they once had will be lost. It's the same as in gardening. The soil needs to be turned over once in a while to allow something new to grow there. So the service book you have there in the pews, we produced that, came out with it in 2013, and it was to replace one or more previous service books that had been in use here for probably 30 years. And those previous books met the needs of the time in which they were created, but were poorly adapted to what I think would be the 21st century Shin Buddhism. So we felt the need to move on, to create a new book. And I think the book has been fairly successful. It's been adopted by quite a few other temples. And without a whole lot of time elapsing, I think most people settled in on the new words, new, slightly different words in some cases, the new words we were using. So we have to turn over the soil once in a while. Okay, continuing to read here. In Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddha's words are not pointing toward physical objects or historical events. They're pointing toward that which is beyond words and concepts. Thus, in Mahayana, there is a basic teaching that words cannot fully capture the meaning. So this quotation is from the Indian master Nagarjuna, which Shinran quotes it. Consider, for example, a person instructing us by pointing to the moon with his finger. To take words to be the meaning is like looking at the finger and not at the moon, okay? Look at the moon. The person would say, I am pointing to the moon with my finger in order to show it to you. Why do you look at my finger and not at the moon? Similarly, words are the finger pointing to the meaning. They are not the meaning itself. Hence, do not rely upon words. Just a remark on that. Not every form of Buddhism makes so much use of words as we do. In Zen, you may know, it's said to be a direct transmission of the Dharma, of limitless reality, direct transmission without words. So, undoubtedly, there are people who can receive the Dharma in that manner. I am not one of them, hence I'm not a Zen Buddhist. But that path does exist for those who have the ability, mostly through meditation. They can receive the Dharma without words. We, however, in Shin Buddhism, we use words, however limited and diluted they may be. So moving on here, Mahayana is compelling for me precisely because it has nothing analogous to the Word of God. Words are an expediency that can point us toward limitless reality, but their effectiveness is temporary. Eventually, as circumstances change, a prior choice of words will cease to be appropriate. Hence, we should be open to finding new words and new ways to connect with the Dharma. The most important scriptures in Shin Buddhism are the Pure Land Sutras. So we just chanted a section of the larger sutra this morning, the Jusei-ge. These teachings are very durable, having shown people the path to awakening for at least 2,000 years. However, they too must be seen as a temporary expression if we take the long view. At the outset, our ability to grasp a meaning that is beyond words is feeble. To help us through our difficulties, the Buddha devises skillful or provisional means that are suited to our circumstances. His words are appropriate for the situation, but they are a transformed or disguised version of what he truly aims to teach. So this is basic to all forms of Mahayana Buddhism, not just Jodo Shinshu. The Buddha discovers that it's necessary to somehow lure us into an understanding despite our misconceptions. So the idea he does this by showing us something that we can be attracted to. And maybe in the context of doing that, we will get closer to the true teaching. So it's a kind of trickery. You could say he's not being completely honest with us, but if he were completely honest at the outset, then apparently we would have no hope. So in this statement at the bottom of the first page, the Buddha says this, Shakyamuni, knowing that living beings have various desires and things to which they are deeply attached, I have taught the Dharma according to their basic nature, using a variety of causal explanations, parables, other kinds of expression, and the power of skillful means. As an illustration, there's a parable in the Lotus Sutra that tells of, you might have heard of this, children playing inside a burning house, a terrifying situation. However, being fixated on their games, what they're playing with, the games, they refuse to flee the inferno until their father entices them outside with the promise of what he says are precious carriages. The carriages might not be real, but the children would perish if not for this deception. So he says, children, put aside those boring games. come out and I'll show you these three wonderful carriages. They're beautiful and you can ride on them. So, enticed outside by their father's words, the children are rescued. Likewise, we would fail to seek liberation without the power of the Buddha's skillful means, what I'll call the disguised teachings. And this actually, this aspect of Buddhism is very important for Shinran. He doesn't use exactly these words to describe it, but it's what he's talking about here. So we'll get into that. It seems to me that the Buddha intends for us eventually to recognize and transcend our attachment to disguised teachings. We have to start there, but don't we ever get beyond that? How? His contribution was to identify a framework for doing so within the Pure Land Sutras. All right, so that there's 3 of these texts. These are the key ancient texts for Buddhism as understood by Shinran. They're called the Pure Land Sutras. We chanted from one of them this morning. He calls the teachings of the undisguised Dharma true and real. That is his phrase. In Japanese, it's Shinjitsu. That's a good word for you to learn, if you'd like to learn just a little bit of Buddhism in Japanese. Shinjitsu. Shin means true, jitsu, real. And he calls the disguised teachings provisional. Provisional. The distinction is of crucial significance for him. We might say that clarifying the distinction between true and real and provisional is itself Shin Buddhism. So here are some passages by Shinran. He says, now, based on the true purport, the true intention of the Buddha's teaching, and the exposition by the masters of the past, I shall clarify that the teachings of the path of sages are provisional, and those of the Pure Land are true. All right? I shall clarify that the teachings of the path of sages are provisional, and those of the Pure Land are true. This term, path of sages, that may be new to you, that refers to Buddhism that teaches spiritual self-improvement. It's not talking about secular self-improvement. We should strive for self-improvement in our secular lives, right? We want to hopefully have a meaningful career, have a family, recreation. These can be ways of secular self-improvement, but Shinran discovered that, I would say Buddhism as a whole, is teaching that spiritual self-improvement is not to be looked at in the same way. All right? So that's what the path of sages generally refers to. So it includes all forms that are not Pure Land Buddhism. Shinran was a Pure Land Buddhist teacher, and Shin Buddhism is one type of Pure Land teaching. So then he says, the next quotation, this has to do with concerning the path of sages. He's talking about conditions at the time he lived in the 13th century. He says this about it. Monks of Shakyamuni's tradition in the various temples, however, lack clear insight into the teachings and are ignorant of the distinction between true and provisional, while scholars in the capital are confused about practices and wholly unable to differentiate right and wrong paths. Shinran famously turned away from that type of Buddhism. He was a monk, he was a practitioner of the path of sages, but he abandoned that and met a different type of teacher, whose teacher was named Honen, and he learned about Jodo Shinshu. So he also goes on to criticize followers of Pure Land Buddhism, not just the path of sages practitioners, but followers of Pure Land Buddhism. He says they also lack insight, as stated in this passage, the next one there. He says, being ignorant of the distinction between true and provisional, people, that means Pure Land followers, misunderstand and lose sight of the Buddha's vast benevolence. The Pure Land followers misunderstand and lose sight of the Buddha's vast benevolence. The way they do this is they make the Pure Land another form of self-improvement. So they've discovered a kind of a hybrid. It's still self-improvement, but they describe it in the words that you might apply to Pure Land Buddhism. So that's another way that the teachings can be provisional for us. But we might still be attracted to them. The Buddha is trying to coax us into learning about something beyond provisional Buddhism. Okay, and then going on here. In the next passage, Shinran differentiates two types of practice and Shinjin. I'm introducing more terms for you here. These are very important ones. Practice. What is practice? Well, we all have sort of a notion of what Buddhist practice is. But in its essence, practice is what brings about a psychological transformation on the Buddhist path. Something happens. Something happens. There's a transformation, and we could call that practice. And it might be something that we do. It might be something that the Buddha does. It can be both of those things. The other term is Shinjin, a Japanese word that we have difficulty translating because it has so many attributes. But Shinjin means self-awareness or a life of awakening. So this is the followers of Shin Buddhism may realize self-awareness. They may experience a life of awakening. I would say that is the aim of the Shin Buddhist path, is to become self-aware, to understand what we really are. So, so this is leading up to his next statement here. Shinran states, he says, generally stated, with regard to the vows, there are true and real practice in Shinjin, and there are practice in Shinjin that are provisional means. Okay, so I'll try to unpack that. With regard to the vows, right? Remember we chanted Jusege this morning? I said we were chanting some of the Buddha's vows. There are 48 of them, as it happens, in the larger sutra. And in that particular set of verses, we were just actually chanting just 3 of them and then elaborating on them. But Shinran's insight was to realize that in this set of 48 vows, they're not all of equal importance for him. There are some that he considers are revealing true and real practice in Shinjin, and there are others that are practice in Shinjin of provisional Buddhism. And it's those that we're going to be attracted to. Those are the ones that are going to attract us at first. The provisional means vows, right? So that was his, I would say, unique contribution was to make this distinction, to say that there are vows that are providing us with a skillful means that it's hoped will eventually allow us to understand the vows that are about true and real practice in Shinjin. All right, so the next statement, he says, provisional means are associated with what's called imperfectly realized Shinjin, which entails trusting without searching and reflecting. Maybe we can come back to that. That's also, will take some unpacking, but it's not crucial right at the outset. Okay, we'll just keep going here. At the bottom of the second page, Shin Buddhism is based on the larger sutra, which teaches that all beings can be liberated by hongan. This is another important Japanese word. It has various meanings. Simplest one is to say hongan is the Buddha's innermost aspiration. Buddha's deepest desire is to attain awakening and to liberate everybody else. That is hongan. In Jodo Shinshu, hongan is more than just the Buddha's aspiration. It's also our own deeply hidden wish to become Buddha, to live the most meaningful life possible. I think for most of us, that is an aspiration. Don't we want to have a meaningful life? Are we content with a life that we think is meaningless? No, I don't think most of us have that idea. But it's kind of hard to express. We don't know how to talk about it. It's something it's like within us, but we can't find necessarily the words to express it. You know, what would it mean? Do I want to become Buddha? That seems so abstract. You know, I don't know what a Buddha is. How could I say I want to become Buddha? Easier words maybe to say, I want this life to be meaningful. That's my aspiration. I'm not counting on another life. Some forms of Buddhism defer meaning to a future existence, maybe in the distant future. That is not Shinran's approach. Shin Buddhism has to do with making this life, here and now, fully meaningful for us, despite our limitations. And we have plenty of limitations, of course. We have our greed, our anger, our ignorance. These are our limitations. But nevertheless, Jodo Shinshu is the way to make this life supremely meaningful without doing away with our greed, anger, and ignorance. So, at the top of third page, just going on a little further, Shinran identifies 6 of the Buddha's vows in the larger sutra as the true and real expression of Hongan. He designates 2 other vows as provisional expressions of Hongan. It's not important for you to know the numbers of those. Maybe eventually you'll want to learn about it. But his writings are, by and large, the elucidation of just those 8 vows. They are the central structuring elements of his entire teaching, and I would say it's analogous to the pillars and the beams that are holding up the building. These 8 vows. So of course we could just admire the building in a kind of a general sense. It's very attractive space in here. We have all this nice decor, tasteful interior design, but shouldn't we want to learn something about the structural elements, the things that are holding up the building? So that's what we would be getting into if we try to understand Shinran a little more. Okay, pretty much on time here. I want to make a point about what Shinran means by truth. You know, truth is kind of it could mean different things to different people, but Shinran is very specific. In setting forth these categories, he is not making claims about what may be true ultimately or theoretically. Some types of philosophy might be called speculative philosophy. That's what they talk about. What's true ultimately? You know, ultimately, what is there in the universe and what's it like? Shinran has no concern with that. Hence, he uses this term shinjitsu, true and real. We have to have both parts, true and real. The Buddha's vows are pointing toward a timeless truth. It's, you might say, the law of the universe, which, according to the larger sutra, is necessarily fulfilled or made real in history. It's pointing to a timeless truth which is necessarily fulfilled or made real in history. In other words, in our lives. It is with respect to the present human condition that teachings are either provisional or true and real. The distinction here is it's psychological, it's situational. That is the kind of truth Shinran is concerned with, not ultimacy or theoretical truth. In other words, it's true for us psychologically, and it depends on the situation, historical circumstances. So, the path of sages' teachings were formerly true and real, but they are no longer so, which he states here. Indeed, we know that the various teachings of the path of sages are practicable. They could be implemented, fulfilled, at the time of the historical Buddha. And for the few centuries following that, called the age of the right Dharma, but not for subsequent ages. Shinran lived 16 centuries after the historical Buddha. And in his view, path of sages that way had become extinct. As far as being, it did not apply to the current situation. The time for those teachings has already passed. They do not agree with the capacities of sentient beings. According to Shinran, institutional Buddhists in his day were attached to teachings and practices that had ceased to be appropriate when the circumstances changed. They took words to be the meaning itself, and hence they were looking at the finger and not at the moon. At the time he was writing this, I won't say he was a minority of one, but there weren't very many people who agreed with him. Most Buddhism in his day was the path of sages. It was exactly what he says no longer agrees with the capacities of beings. That's what almost everyone else considered Buddhism to be. So it's kind of remarkable that in the centuries after his death, Jodo Shinshu, it actually became the most prevalent form of Buddhism in Japan. Not because of his brilliant ability as an organizer. That wasn't his way. It was because of his ability or his persistence as a truth seeker. So in the years following his death, other people, he shared the Dharma a great deal with other people, but it was still pretty small scale. But in the centuries that followed, it became a very large scale phenomenon. But he should definitely be seen as a nonconformist. He was a total nonconformist. Throughout his long life, Shinran was never content with fixed interpretations. In many cases, his understanding of a sutra text was quite different than the traditional or basic reading of the Chinese characters. Same characters. He arrives at a very different way of reading them. By continually discarding his preconceptions about Buddhism and by looking beyond the words for the deeper meaning, he came to appreciate the distinction between provisional and true and real. Shinran did not simply reject the provisional teachings. This is important. He didn't simply reject them. He didn't say, forget about those 2 vows. He said, no, they're very important. They are the words of the Buddha, after all. What he discovered in them was a skillful means residing on the surface, pointing to the deeper meaning within. So we're attracted by what's on the surface. This gives us an opening. A door can open to the Dharma by means of the provisional teachings. He says, profound indeed is the intent behind the temporary vows. It's what the Buddha planned. And so he found that this was, it was realized in his own life. He didn't start out with this understanding, but looking back on his life, he says, this is what happened to me. Yes, Shinran interpreted the provisional teachings as representing the stages of spiritual development that a person goes through to realize awakening. At times, I have encountered the view that we can access true and real Buddhism immediately without following provisional Buddhism. This view seems quite wrong to me. I think it's necessary that we embrace the disguised teachings that fit our preconceptions. And in fact, when we speak about Buddhism, unless we're reading Shinran's words, when we speak about Buddhism, we are generally considering provisional teachings. That's mostly what we talk about, rather than Jodo Shinshu. Our calculating mind, we embrace disguised teachings that fit our preconceptions. Right? The calculating mind, the mind that's thinking about its own interest, self-interest, it leads us to provisional Buddhism, and we never completely let go of it. I think that's true. We never completely let go of it. But by encountering our limitations, the weakness of what might be called a path of sages mentality, when we encounter that, we become more aware of our limitations, and that's where we can get a glimpse of what he would call the true and real teaching of Hongan. Shinran saw in the sutras a template for his own life experience. This template can resonate in the life of every Shin Buddhist follower. To make Shinran's experience our own, I think, is to have found the Shin Buddhist path. So, my aim was to at least talk about some attributes of Jodo Shinshu in the way that, I hope the way that Shinran does. Maybe I'm misrepresenting him, but I feel we have to try. And I think we need repeated exposure. We need to get somewhat comfortable with his terminology. And in this way we can, I think, make the teachings true and real for us. So we can say there's the universe is trying to convey this truth, but can it be realized in our lives? So that's, I would say, the great challenge. And going back to what I said at the outset, it's not required that we use words. It's not required that we study at all. You know, there are people who have realized Shinjin who were illiterate. In fact, in earlier centuries, most Shin Buddhist followers could not read and write. So they obviously weren't reading the teachings. They were listening to teachers, but mostly they were just struggling to stay alive. So we have a quite different set of circumstances here. I hope none of you are struggling to stay alive. I mean, most of us aren't. Our needs are, on the whole, provided for pretty well. So we also can read. We can listen to a lot of different teachers. And, you know, if the intuitive approach is not ultimately effective, you could say it's a fallback. It's a provisional means. We can rely on listening to and reflecting on the teachings. So I'd be happy to take listen to any of your comments and try to respond. I think we have a couple of microphones that can be passed around. Just for example, how do you react to this statement on the first page? Do not rely upon words. Can you imagine a religion that doesn't rely on words? That's what Zen is said to be. I know they talk a lot, but yeah, Jane, go ahead. Is it on? I don't know if it's switched on. Still not working. I can hear you. If
his argument here that even the Lotus Sutra, or the larger sutra that we study, are just provisional teachings, gets way beyond.
Great question. So the way Shinran looked at it was to say that, you know, all three of the Pure Land Sutras, there's three of them. Larger Sutra is the most lengthy and the one that he mostly focused on. Both provisional and true and real teachings are contained in these. And for him, it was the challenge was to, you know, understand which was which. So the sutra itself doesn't say this. The sutra does not say, okay, these next two vows are provisional means. These next five are true and real. The sutra doesn't say that. This is his interpretation. But both attributes are contained within all three sutras in his unique interpretation. I don't think anyone prior to that had looked at him in that way. That's a great question. So, and we don't know, if we just read the sutra without, you know, being aware of what Shinran thought about it, we would not understand that either. So the I do suggest reading the Pure Land Sutras. They're not very long. If you look at the bottom of page 1, there's a reference to it's a modern translation. It's very good. It's 2 slim paperbacks, and you can get it from the online store, the BCA's online store. Those particular volumes have a good introduction and a glossary of terms. So that's what Shinran was reading. But then he had a lot to say about it. He had a lot to say about it. Just the words on the face of it were not nearly, his meaning would not be immediately apparent to us. So it's good to know what was on his bookshelf, but then we also have to study other references to learn what he thought about it.
So I'm an ordinary person living my life, and how would I, if I'm not a scholar, know that I've encountered something that's true and real? How do I know that that's
You
not?
wouldn't. That's a good question. So Shinran did the scholarship. He did the heavy lifting. We would never have figured this out, right? So we can, reflect on his life example, on the powerful words that he left for us, and gradually, I think, become aware of his manner of thinking. There's many other Buddhist teachers, right? We don't have to be followers of Shinran. This is, as it turns out, this is the most suitable path for me. I can say that with some certainty. There's not another Buddhist path that would have been suitable or would have attracted me, but there's plenty of other approaches. You could become a Zen follower or a Theravadan. I think a way into this form of Buddhism, it won't begin with reading the collected works of Shinran. That's just impossible for us. We're not in a position to do that. So that's why at Orange County Buddhist Church we bring in speakers who will help us, who will provide perhaps just a little bit of an opening to that. And coming up on September the 21st, Saturday, is our fall Higan seminar with Reverend Dr. Ken Tanaka. He's an excellent speaker, and he'll probably cover things at a more introductory level than what I've tried to do here today. So I would encourage you to attend that, or attend our spring Higan seminar. For many years it's been with Dr. Haneda, and he always talks about Shinran's teaching. And I think we have to, unless we follow an intuitive approach, right? That's still open. You can become a Myokonin. If that isn't for you, then, and you want to you have a sincere interest in Buddhism, consider reading some books about Shin Buddhism. And there are a few of them out there. Yeah, go ahead.
Jim, I'm reflecting upon your earlier statement about the pointing of the finger and not really seeing the target, and that the teachings and all the teachings are really the finger. And for us as just normal, foolish human beings, it's how do we transcend looking at the finger and getting to the target. And it seems like, when you talk about people who have transcended, they've really adopted the life of selflessness and a life of gratitude. And how do we change and adopt that, and rather than just completely focusing on the finger and never making that transition.
We need those examples. We have to pay attention to them, right? So for many of us, these two ladies are not here, so I can freely talk about it. They have a deep appreciation of Shinran's teaching. I don't think I would call them myokonin. I mean, you could, I suppose, but no, they got that way by listening. Many years of listening to the teachings and reflecting on it. And also as a result of their life experiences, which for both of them, extreme difficult experiences earlier in life. That's why I mentioned, sometimes personal hardship enters into it. Of course, I don't want any of you to have personal hardship. But we can, in a sense, kind of model our behavior by looking at them. They don't come to the temple much anymore, sadly. They're both old and quite frail. Old physically. They're both very young, spiritually. Yeah, but there are others. So, keep an eye out. And yours is a great question, Alan. Fortunately, we don't have to walk this path, using our own efforts, right? In a sense, we have to make some effort, but ultimately what counts is the things we take refuge in, right? We all know Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, right? So Buddha means, of course, it means the historical Buddha. It means the figure in the center of the altar, Amida Buddha, not the historical teacher, but this kind of limitless reality that is being represented as that human-like image. All right, so Buddha. It also means the teachers we meet in person, right? So I can name several teachers who've been pivotal for me in kind of opening this path. So Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Then Dharma means, it means limitless reality. What the teachings are pointing to, the moon, in other words. But Dharma also means the words, right? The words of teachers and, what we read, what we hear, what we learn from other Sangha members, right? We're learning from their life stories. That's all the Dharma. And then Sangha means to become, we take refuge in Sangha, become part of this community, right? We're not kind of, plodding along on our own. There are others who are joining with us on this path. So we have to take refuge in all three of these things. And I think we have to, bring a certain amount of seriousness to what it is we're doing. Are we listening seriously, right? Are we seeking the way? And so it's, I can't answer it for anyone else. But we have to somehow get just a little bit away from all the things that distract us. So that's why it's so important to come here. We see other people who are on the path, and we can, at least for a little bit, reflect on what it is we are and what Buddhism has to teach us. So there's no magic bullet, but those are the steps I would suggest.